What's up, and welcome back to another episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. I'm your host, Mason Kinnahan, and today we are going to be talking about a lot of things. First off, we're going to be talking about Brian Robinson, kind of an update on the trade rumors surrounding him. Then we'll get into my final 53-man roster prediction for the Washington Commanders. That's going to be a fun one. I know there's still one more preseason game left, which we'll preview at the end, but pretty much all but, just a couple of spots are already decided by the coaches. So we'll get into a full 53-man roster prediction. One game isn't really going to change that much, if anything, at this point. So we'll get into that as well. I'm going to be moving back to my college this weekend, so I will be kind of out of commission for a little bit while doing that until we get the setup back next week. So going to give the 53-man roster prediction a little bit early, but I'm looking forward to it. But first, let's jump into the Brian Robinson headlines that have been going around recently. Robinson is set to be traded by the Commanders at some point. If he's not traded, he's going to be released. This sounds like a trade or release situation. It sounds like Brian Robinson has played his last snap for the Washington Commanders. He was not even in the building on Monday night for Washington's preseason game against the Cincinnati Bengals. In addition, he was not at practice on Wednesday. It was an excused absence from him, as the coaching staff and his party as well mutually decided that it was in their best interest to not attend practice on Wednesday. So I don't think he's going to be back at the Commanders practice facility ever, really, unless he signs a new deal with them and comes back at some point in his career. But it really sounds like Robinson's days in Washington are done, which, again, you think about this a week ago, that sounds pretty crazy, but it kind of just makes sense with the emergence of Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, with the emergence of Chris Rodriguez on Monday night, along with just how they've performed in training camp so far during this offseason, during the summer. That's where we're at right now. And Brian Robinson is set to be off this team in the coming days. Again, potentially even when this episode comes out after I finish recording. So there's a lot on the line here for this running back position. And as you see, the Dolphins seem to be the favorites to land a guy like Brian Robinson. The infamous Twitter dog, that is posting some insider information, has reported that the Dolphins are favorites to land Brian Robinson. Now there's other teams interested. Sounds like the Cowboys, the Niners, the Texans are all in the running back market right now. All of those teams are looking for running backs. So maybe Washington ends up trading Robinson to one of those teams. I think it would be pretty funny if he ends up being traded to Dallas, as that connection between Dallas and Washington. I feel like there's a lot of transactions between those two teams with each other and with ex players and all of that, for just those teams being division rivals and having one of the biggest rivalries in the NFL. But do trade with each other a lot, which I find pretty interesting. So especially, just with running backs, it wasn't a trade, but, Alfred Morris went over to Dallas as well after Washington. So just running backs going between Washington and Dallas and New York even as well has been pretty funny and pretty, just interesting over the last decade or so, just because those guys, all those teams are division rivals. But that is pretty much that on Brian Robinson. Just wanted to touch on it a little bit. It really seems like, I doubt he's on the roster this time next week. By this time next week, we will know the 53, or mostly we'll probably know about 51 of the 53 on this roster. There still could be, one or two moves that are pending, or, one or two spots that are open for players that will ultimately get cut. But with that being said, let's jump into my prediction of who those 53 players will be. We'll start with the offense. In total, I have 25 players on the offense. There is a lot to unpack here, you could say, of the positions and of the players that I chose, but we'll just get started with this. Quarterback. This is pretty simple. Jane Daniels, Marcus Mariota, those are your two quarterbacks. Just two. Last year, Washington had three quarterbacks. Hartman was on the 53-man roster, but he was on the 53-man roster, but he was the emergency third quarterback. Or not Hartman. Jeff Driscoll was the emergency third quarterback. There's one thing I want to note, and I've every year now I've kind of seen people misunderstand this rule, for the emergency third quarterback, the emergency third quarterback counts towards your 53-man roster. If you want to have a third quarterback on your 53-man roster, that quarterback will count. What that quarterback won't count against is your 45-man active roster for game days. You can have 45 on the active roster for a game, but 53-man on your, main roster. So the 45-player active roster is what was where the emergency third quarterback comes in. So you would activate a third. You don't have to activate a third quarterback in case of emergency, for that 45-man roster. But for the 53-man roster, if you were to have a third quarterback, and you want to classify him as emergency, he will still count towards those 53. So that's one of the reasons why I only have two here: Jane Daniels, Marcus Mariota. We now know what we have in Daniels. Mariota has been able to, work this Cliff Kingsbury offense very well. We saw in those couple of starts that he had last year with Jane Daniels out for one game due to injury, and then against Dallas as more of a resting type of thing. But for those two players, it should be no surprise. Daniels, Mariota, the two quarterbacks here on my final roster. This means that Sam Hartman and Josh Johnson will not make it. Hartman and Johnson still fighting for that QB3 spot. Ultimately, I think both of them end up on the practice squad. If not both of them, then just one of them will end up on the practice squad while one of them signs on a different team. But I don't see either of those guys. Neither of them have shown that they really want to win. I mean, they definitely probably want to win this QB3 battle, but neither of them have showed me why I would want to have them on the active roster, not on the active roster, but on the 53-man roster. So just Daniels and Mariota at the quarterback position. Let's move to running back now, because this is the position I was just talking about. The running backs, I don't have Brian Robinson on this final roster, which is, again, something that would be pretty crazy to say a week and a half ago, but it makes sense. And if you have him on the 53-man roster, on your 53-man roster prediction, I would kind of call you crazy just because of the situation they're in. Currently, I would say they're in a you cannot go back from this situation if you're Brian Robinson and if you're Dan Quinn, Adam Peters, and the Washington Commanders. So what does my running back room consist of? Well, you've got Austin Eckler as the RB1. Eckler and kind of friends at this point, right? Because you got Eckler, who's going to be coming in on certain situations more as a receiving back, more of a back that can, spread the offense horizontally, while these other running backs like Bill Krosky-Merritt, Chris Rodriguez, and Jerry McNichols, the other three I have on this 53-man roster, Rodriguez is more of your power back, right? Dan Quinn actually said it in the press conference on, Thursday. On Thursday, Rodriguez will now be getting those snaps at power back that Brian Robinson got last year. So I really see Rodriguez being kind of the RB2 right now for Washington. If you say Eckler gets the most snaps, I would say Rodriguez gets the second most snaps, at least for the first couple of weeks, at least, until Bill Krosky-Merritt jumps him in the depth chart, which I have him listed above Rodriguez in the depth chart. But I think this coaching staff for Washington really likes Chris Rodriguez. And Robinson did play a lot of snaps in that power back role last year. If Rodriguez ends up being that power back guy, hopefully he's able to succeed, because this is kind of a big risk. This is a guy that this very same staff released last year at this point. And now he's going to be one of the main backs in your backfield. It shows the growth that Rodriguez has had over the last year for sure. But this is a bold move by this front office staff, moving on from Brian Robinson, a guy that what you're getting out of him. I'm not saying he was one of the best running backs in the league by any means. I'm just saying you knew what you're going to have out of Brian Robinson. And now Chris Rodriguez is a guy who has shown flashes in the regular season when he's gotten the opportunity, but has not had as large of a role as he's going to have this upcoming season. Bill Krosky-Merritt is also going to have a pretty big role now without Brian Robinson. He's shown that, he's got some speed. He's got some agility that some of these other running backs in this running back room don't have. And especially with Eckler, just the amount of concussions that he had last year, plus the inconsistency in terms of his health. Bill Krosky-Merritt could be the new Austin Eckler in terms of being that receiving back that can also, just break one free for 25, 30 yards all of a sudden. And then Jerry McNichols, I had as well. McNichols was someone you bring in for that pass pro. Robinson really became a pretty solid pass protection running back last year. And getting rid of him, you don't really know what you have in Bill Krosky-Merritt in terms of pass pro. Chris Rodriguez is not an entirely great pass protector. McNichols, I would say, is definitely better than Rodriguez. And then Eckler isn't really a pass protector either. So McNichols, I think, makes this roster as the fourth running back. I think they ultimately keep 4 instead of 3, but I wouldn't be surprised if McNichols doesn't. This was one I had kind of 50-50 on. If Jerry McNichols makes this roster, doesn't, I think those other 3 are definitely locks at this point, but I have McNichols on this roster. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver position now. Wide receivers. All right, you've got Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel, Noah Brown, Jalen Lane, Luke McCaffrey, and KJ Osborne are your 6 receivers on this 53-man roster prediction. This is pretty self-explanatory. I mean, if you've been watching Commanders games, this is pretty much it. The only question would be, I think, those final 2. Luke McCaffrey has just been a ghost in the preseason games so far. It's been very disappointing for a second-year wide receiver that was, a day 2 pick. Even though he was back on day 2, he was still a day 2 pick and someone who has a lot to prove this season. And only having, 2 catches this entire preseason so far with the amount of snaps that he's played is not good. I still think McCaffrey makes this roster just because of his special teams ability, but that is something to monitor because I'm starting to lose hope a little bit on Luke McCaffrey. KJ Osborne, I really see this wide receiver 6 position being anyone, not even someone not on this roster. I just said KJ Osborne. I feel Osborne, Gallup are kind of the 2 front runners to be this wide receiver 6. Ja'Cory Brooks, I think you can hide on the practice squad. No one's really going to pick him up. Osborne is someone who I think has he's been on this team the longest of those 3, right? And is someone that I think has played well enough in the preseason to earn a spot. It's really between him and Gallup to me. I would go with Osborne. I could also see them going with Gallup just because of the connection that he has with Dan Quinn already. But it's probably going. It's I would say it's a 33% chance it's Osborne. 32% chance, or sorry, yeah, I would say maybe it's like 35% chance it's Osborne. No, this is not good math. All right, 30% chance it's Osborne, 30% chance it's Gallup, 30% chance it's someone not on this roster, and 10% chance it's Ja'Cory Brooks. I feel like that's where things are at currently. Osborne and Gallup are just right there, 1, 2. Do they want the deep threat in Michael Gallup, or do they want more of a contested catch guy in KJ Osborne? And then Ja'Cory Brooks, do they want to be a younger guy compared to a veteran? That's why you would pick Brooks. But I still think Osborne and Gallup have played better than Ja'Cory Brooks. I wouldn't say they've played better, but they've played more meaningful snaps in terms of where Osborne and Gallup are ahead in the depth chart compared to Ja'Cory Brooks. So it's either going to be one of those 3 or it's going to be someone not on this roster at this point. In terms of the other guys, Terry McLaurin, I think he'll be definitely back and playing. I don't see him being the guy to skip out on games, missing $1 million a week, just because of this contract situation. Deebo Samuel, Noah Brown is an interesting one. Noah Brown could start the season on injured reserve. I wouldn't be surprised, but I have him active on this roster. So that is definitely an injured reserve candidate, though. I'll get into who I think will be placed on injured reserve at the beginning of this season, which they have some new rules for who can and cannot be placed on injured reserve and the effects of that, which I'll get into in a second here once we get to the offensive line. But then Jalen Lane as well. That's going to be your punt returner this year for Washington. He's played well in the preseason, especially the second preseason game. You could see he was out there. He was active. He made his presence felt in that game against the Bengals. So Lane, I think it's definitely the wide receiver 4 in this situation, but then it's just a big gap between Lane and everyone else in this wide receiver room. All right, let's move on to tight ends now. Tight ends, I've got 4 tight ends. Zach Ertz, John Bates, Ben Sinnott, and Colson Yankoff are my 4 tight ends on this active roster. Well, not active, but you guys know what I mean. 53-man roster, same things. And, Zach Ertz, Bates, and Sinnott, I think, are all locks at this point. Again, it's similar to McCaffrey. It's kind of been a little bit of a disappointing preseason for Ben Sinnott. John Bates has been, such a good blocking tight end for Washington throughout his career, and especially in the preseason so far. He's been awesome and so fun to watch. I made a little bit of a, preseason highlights vid for him, which was cool. So, and that was pretty cool. And of course, Mr. Reliable, Zach Ertz, I think is going to be in for another big year if he can stay healthy. Washington is relying on a lot of these veterans to stay healthy, which they got lucky and they did stay healthy for majority of last season. But I mean, it's a tight line. You're walking on a tightrope here, trying to balance things, trying to keep these older veterans healthy because they are more injury prone than some of these younger guys who have not yet, you could say, shown their potential in McCaffrey and Sinnott. Colson Yankoff might be a surprise to some people that he's on my final roster here, but I think Yankoff is kind of a lock. I feel like this tight end room is the most, beyond quarterback, of course. I feel this tight end room is the most known of who's going to be making this roster. I think it's just going to be these 4. Ertz, Bates, Sinnott. Yankoff has been great on special teams. He's been practicing with the first team special teams units, which usually is a good sign that you're going to be making this roster. He made it last year. I think he makes it again in 2025. Let's move on now to the offensive line. And this is where things get interesting. I've got 9 offensive linemen for Washington, technically 10, but I'm considering Sam Cosmi is going to be placed on injured reserve to start this season. I think there's a kind of 50-50 chance if he does or doesn't. Dan Quinn has been very, you could say, not helpful in me trying to figure out if, Cosmi is ready or not, just because he's kind of not really revealed that much in terms of he's beyond saying, oh, Cosmi's hitting all of the right checkpoints and all of that. You don't exactly know the entire story there. How many checkpoints are there? Even though he is hitting these checkpoints in his recovery, how many of them are there? How many does he have left? I would maybe say there's a slightly better chance than not. He's not on the injured reserve list to start the year, but in this scenario, I have him on it. So then I have 9 offensive linemen beyond that. Oh, one thing, the injured reserve list, which I want to talk about. Teams can place 2 players in the preseason on injured reserve that don't end the season, like that it doesn't end the season. So you don't have to place them on the 53-man roster because before you had to have them on the 53-man roster first before you could place them on injured reserve. But now you can just you don't have you as for 2 of them, you don't have to have that situation. You can just place them on injured reserve and it won't mean that they're out for the entire year. It would only mean that they're out for 4 games, which is the normal injured reserve length. So Cosmi, I think, would be placed on that short-term injured reserve. As far as the players that I have on this team, Laremy Tunsil, Josh Connolly, Trent Scott, and George Fant are the 4 tackles for Washington. I think these 4 are pretty solid. Especially they got some good depth. I think Trent Scott is a good swing tackle, can play both sides. George Fant was the most recent signing, or maybe second most recent signing now for Washington. I think Fant is someone that will make this roster. I think he's someone they just saw their exterior or their outside line offensive line depth, and it kind of lacked right now. So I think they added Fant for that. And then on the interior, Brandon Coleman, Tyler Biadasz, Nick Allegretti, Andrew Wiley, and Chris Paul. Chris Paul has played great for Washington. I think the release of Julian Good-Jones kind of cements Paul into the final roster at this point in time. Coleman seems to be on the right track in terms of health. I think he's back practicing, or at least in some portion. So that is good for Brandon Coleman and for this offensive line. Biadasz has been the center all camp long. Nick Allegretti, I think, is going to, replace what Michael Dieter's role was last year, kind of a backup center / guard, can play both positions. I think Allegretti He's been practicing some at center as well. He's got some experience at center. I think he's going to be in that Michael Dieter role from last season. Andrew Wiley, I think, is a really good piece for Washington, which, 3 years ago with that Ron Rivera offensive line, when Wiley was the big free agent addition for, I think it was the Howell year at the time, he really struggled on the outside. But I really think he's improved and has been, yes, he has his moments, but he's been a very solid tackle for Washington. He's not like super great or anything, but he's been somewhat reliable for Washington. And in the role that he's been given, he's kind of just accepted it, which is cool because some players just want to play on the outside. They want to get that starting time, but I don't know if Wiley's going to get it with Josh Connolly out there at right tackle. I think Connolly starts at right tackle week 1, so and it's not going to be like a Brandon Coleman, Cornelius Lucas situation where one plays one drive, one plays the other drive. I think in this situation, it'll be Connolly out there for all of the drives week 1. So that means Wiley's going to be either pushed inside to Sam Cosmi's position, I assume so, or he's going to be at Brandon Coleman's left guard position if Coleman can't go. I would hope that Coleman can go at this point, but it is something to monitor that this offensive line, the starting offensive line, has not gotten a lot of practice time so far. Laremy Tunsil, Brandon Coleman, Tyler Biadasz, Sam Cosmi, and Josh Connolly, they have not all practiced yet together. They won't until Cosmi's back to practicing, but they also were missing Brandon Coleman for a good portion of time, which that's both of your guards. That's 2 big losses in terms of practice time and ability to play in a live game with those guys. So that is also something to look at. But that is the offense that I have. Like I mentioned, 25 players for the Washington Commanders on offense. Let's move on now to the defensive side of the ball. This is going to be fun. This defensive side, we'll start here with the defensive line. I have how many? Nine. I have 9 defensive linemen for the Washington Commanders. That is a large amount. They had 8 last year, 9 if you counted Jamin Davis, but 8 last year for Washington, 9 this year. I think that's Dorrance Armstrong, Von Miller, Dietrich Wise, Jacob Martin, Jalen Holmes are your starting pass rushers. Or not starting pass rushers, but are the pass rushers that make it here onto the 53-man roster. And then Daron Payne, Johnny Newton, Javon Kinlaw, and Eddie Goldman are your 4 interior defenders. This is this is a pretty stacked position. I've mentioned it in previous podcasts, but this position has a lot of competition, especially on the back end. You look at the guys here I would hypothetically cut in this scenario, right? Clelin Ferrell, that's a starter last year that would not make this roster. Javonte Jean-Baptiste, right? The 7th round 2024 pick who maybe had some flashes last season, but he's kind of been hurt throughout training camp this year, would not make this roster. I don't know for how long he's going to be injured for, but I think he might be back at practicing. If he is practicing, this is a big game for him on Saturday. He's not playing any of the preseason games so far. If he does end up playing in Saturday's preseason game, that is a huge game for him, just because he needs to show and what he can do that's different than the rest of the other linemen here in this group. I think maybe a surprise here is picking Jalen Holmes over a guy like Clelin Ferrell or Javonte Jean-Baptiste. Holmes is someone that really impressed me, especially in that first preseason game. The second one was a little bit more of a struggle for him, but he showed enough to me that I think he can be that back end edge rusher for the Washington Commanders on this roster. Ferrell's contract is very movable. It's very cheap, so I wouldn't worry about that. Even though he did have a major role last year for Washington, I would assume that I don't think he's going to make this roster, and his contract is not something Adam Peters is worried about. Jacob Martin has had a very good first couple of preseason games. I think he's a roster lock now. At this point, he's taking a spot away from one of those Javonte Jean-Baptiste or Clelin Ferrells or maybe Jalen Holmes, right? I think he's locked himself into a roster spot. Dietrich Wise, one of the new free agent additions for Washington from the Patriots. He's someone that I think is going to be sneaky good this year for the Commanders. I think he's just going to put up, average to slightly above average performances every single week, which is good because you want consistency which is something Washington did not have last year at the edge rusher position. Washington had some high highs, but they also had some pretty bad lows as well. So Wise is someone I think is going to have a sneaky good year. And then Armstrong and Miller as your top two edge rushers. Armstrong could be in for a pretty big year as well. Plus, it's going to be fun watching Von Miller, a future first ballot Hall of Famer in the burgundy and gold. And then on the interior, you got Daron Payne, Johnny Newton, Javon Kinlaw, and Eddie Goldman. Like I said, Goldman would be there for that run-stopping defense along with Javon Kinlaw. Johnny Newton, I want to see some more pass rush moves from him, more pass rush success. And Daron Payne in a contract year, hopefully that's a good thing because last time he was in a contract year, he had a pretty good year. I believe that was the best year of his career. So Daron Payne contract year hopefully means that we get some more production out of him. That's the defensive line room. Again, 9 defensive linemen. Let's move on to the linebackers now. I've got 4 linebackers, 5 potentially, but 4. Bobby Wagner, Frankie Louvu, Nick Bellore, and Kane Medrano are my 4. A guy that's missing is Jordan McGee. I think McGee starts this season on injured reserve. He has not yet practiced from an injury that's kind of set him back here in the preseason. I don't think he'll be ready for the start of the year. I think McGee is a prime short-term injury reserve candidate for Washington. Medrano is the rookie. Medrano is there's been some struggles in coverage so far in the first couple of games, but he's also shown some things that I've liked as well. I think he's a roster lock though, just because they just spent a 5th round pick on him. Nick Bellore, I think, is definitely a solid special teams guy. He's one of the better kickoff return guys in the league, which the unit has struggled this year for sure here in the preseason, but hopefully, they're able to bounce back in the regular season. And Wagner and Louvu. What else are we going to talk about? One of the best linebacker duos in the league. Could we be in for maybe a Wagner down year? Potentially. But hopefully, he can still play at the level he was playing at last season, because that was some of the best linebacker play we've seen in quite some time for the Commanders. Cornerback position now. 5 cornerbacks in this one. Marshawn Lattimore, Mike Sainristil, Trey Amos, Jonathan Jones, and Noah Igbenogany are my 5 cornerbacks. That means guys like Carlin Vigors and Bobby Price don't make the roster in this scenario. Lattimore, Sainristil, Amos, Jones, and Igbenogany. Lattimore, again, hopefully he can stay healthy. The big thing for him is just staying healthy, because when he's healthy, he's good out there. He's going to be good for Washington. So just for him, it's a matter of staying healthy. Mike Sainristil, year 2, Frozone is going to be so fun to watch. Trey Amos, the rookie, was held out of Monday's preseason game due to a little bit of a hamstring injury, I believe, or maybe it was illness. I couldn't remember. I think it was a hamstring injury. They just want to be precautious, though. But I think he is back at practice and practicing. Jonathan Jones is going to be a solid piece for Washington. Can play both inside and outside, but I think he will probably back up Sainristil on the he'll probably play on the outside, actually, now that I think about it, because Noah Igbenogany, who I think has had a really good preseason and training camp so far, is going to be backing up Sainristil on the inside. And Igbenogany was like sneakily one of the best slot corners in the league last year for a portion of time. So I think Igbenogany, if he performs like that again, that is a very good luxury to have. And I think was one of the best, maybe keeps for Washington in free agency this past March, as Igbenogany was a free agent, ended up coming back to Washington. I think he was sneaky good for them last season on that defense. And now the final position on this defensive side, safety. Will Harris, Quan Martin, Jeremy Reeves, Percy Butler, and Tyler Owens are my 5 safeties. Shouldn't be any surprises here. Percy Butler, you could say, maybe is on the hot seat a little bit. If they want to keep someone else on this roster, or maybe only want to keep 4 safeties on this roster, you could say Percy Butler is on the hot seat. Will Harris is the new free agent addition, which I have heard not a lot about so far. I think he performed pretty well on Monday night, but I want to see more of him. I'm excited to see him just because I feel he's kind of just a big question mark right now for Washington. Quan Martin, I think, is in for a pretty big year. If he's been improving every year of his career so far, now in year 4, I believe, for Quan. Was it 2022? Yeah, year 4 for Quan. I think he's going to have a solid year for them. Jeremy Reeves, the coaching staff has said it. He's going to have a much larger role in the defensive side of the ball, which I love his energy. I love how he moves downhill. make some pretty big hits, pretty big tackles. If he can stay healthy and, not crush his head on some of those tackles sometimes, because I feel like he's, spearheading himself into the defenders. But if he can clean up that tackling for him a little bit and stay healthy, I think he's going to be a great backup safety for Washington. Percy Butler, I talked about already, a little bit on the hot seat there if they were only to keep 4, because Tyler Owens, I think Washington will keep just because of his special teams ability, which Percy Butler as well is. No, now that I think about it, I forgot. Percy Butler signed that 1-year contract extension, so he is a lock onto this 53-man roster because I forgot he signed that contract extension. So he is a lock, and then Tyler Owens as well. Both of those guys are some pretty good special teamers. But that'll wrap it up. That's 25 players on the defensive side of the ball for Washington as well. In total, that is 50. You add on 3 more: Matt Gay, Tress Way, and Tyler Ott. Those are your 3 to make 53 on this roster. It's probably some of the biggest names that I cut. You could say Clelin Ferrell. You could say Michael Gallup. Ja'Cory Brooks didn't make it. Brian Robinson, of course, which I think is an obvious one, but still a pretty big name. No QB3, only 2 quarterbacks on this roster. And then Cosme and Jordan McGee on injured reserve. But that'll do it for the 53-man roster prediction. I do want to touch on the Ravens game on Saturday, tomorrow when this episode comes out. Commanders and Ravens on Saturday. I believe that kickoff is at noon. I will not have a post-game pod for that just because it's a 3rd preseason game. I'm also, over the weekend and on Monday and Tuesday, going to be moving in to my college dorm. But I'm still going to have my eye on the game. If you want to hear my thoughts on it, you can follow my Twitter at Mason_Kinnahan. That is where I'm going to be posting about all of the stuff and all my takeaways from the Commanders-Ravens game, preseason game. But just some storylines heading into this one. The battle for QB3. If they were to keep a QB3 on this roster, which I don't think will happen, I think there's just going to be at least 1 quarterback, maybe 2 on the practice squad. But if they had to pick one over the other, Hartman versus Johnson, I would lean Johnson currently, but I think it's still up in the air. And if either of them, is kind of like throws for 175, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks, I think you win the job. So that battle is up in the air. I think the back end of the defensive line room is still up in the air as well. But beyond that, I feel pretty much everyone else is probably set to go on this roster. I believe Washington has to cut down the roster by Monday. I want to say Monday or Tuesday. One of those days is when they have to cut it down to 53. It's not a good week to be an NFL player right now because you've got over, I think, 3,000 or over 2,000 players on rosters right now. And by the end of this week, it'll be down to 1,000 or like 1,200, something like that. So like over 1,000 people lose their jobs in the next few days. Which, yeah, one of the hardest times of the year in the NFL. But, it's a crucial one. It's a crucial one because this is how you shape out the final parts of your roster. But that'll pretty much do it for today's episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. The next episode will be out sometime next week. I'm going to be going over game by game my schedule prediction for the Washington Commanders. Will probably be towards the back end of next week if I had to guess. Before then, 2 Mondays from now, starting up again, have some guests on and talk about this team and the Giants. The Giants, who is going to be the week 1 game for the Washington Commanders. I think the Giants are sneaky good. I think they are sneaky good, especially on the defensive side of the football. I think they could be a problem for this Washington team. Not saying that Washington's going to lose or anything, but I think there's definitely some guys you got to look out for on that Giants defense. But that'll pretty much wrap up this week's episode of Keeping Up with the Commanders. I've been your host, Mason Kinnahan. See you guys next one. Peace.